Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Karl Popper, in his essay Towards a Rational Theory of Tradition, while he is in the course of discussing the tasks of social theory or its problems, he's going to focus in for a while on what he calls a second and more important problem, and he identifies it as what is the function of tradition in social life. And he says that has it any function which is rationally understandable in the way that we can give an account of, say, the function of schools or the police force or a grocer's shop or other such social institutions? And we'll look at the difference between institutions and traditions a little bit later. He says, can we analyze the functions of traditions? This is perhaps the main task of a theory of tradition. So it's one that he himself has to engage in. If you're going to have a rationalist theory of tradition, well, it better provide an account of what it is that traditions are doing for the people who are involved in them. And at first, Popper says, all right, so I am going to look at a particular example, the particular tradition that we can call the rationalist, or scientific tradition. And he says, I intend to later make use of this analysis for various purposes. And he says one of the main purposes is going to draw a parallel between, on the one side, the theories which, after submitting them to scientific tests, we hold as a result of the rational or critical attitude. On the other side, beliefs, attitudes, traditions, and generals, and the way that they may help to orient ourselves, especially in the social world. And that is what he's going to deliver on. So he wants to examine a particular important, kind of off, strange tradition, one that he will actually talk about later when we look at the scientific thing, is incorporating a second order tradition. But we don't need to worry too much about that here. And just to give you a little bit of this in outline, he's going to talk about what the ancient Greek philosophers were doing. And he says, the peculiar thing we call scientific tradition has been discussed a lot. People have often wondered about this queer thing that happened somehow, somewhere in Greece in the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ, the invention of a rational philosophy. What did actually happen? Why did it happen? How? Some modern thinkers assert the Greek philosophers were the first to try to understand what happens in nature. I don't think that's a good account, and we'll look at that a bit more later. He says that really what was going on is the early Greek philosophers began to discuss matters of the world and of the myths that were being used to make sense of them. Instead of accepting the religious tradition uncritically and unalterable, instead of merely handing on a tradition, they challenged it and sometimes even invented a new myth in place of the old one. But what they were doing was working with myths, and he's going to stress this at a number of points. He's going to say they, in effect, invented a new tradition, a tradition of adopting a critical attitude towards myths, and this is the beginnings of modern Western science, something we take for granted today, and there's a lot that's passing to get us from there to here. And we're going to look at his views on the development of science a little bit later. Now, later in the essay, he is going to begin talking about the broader functions of tradition. So why do we, in fact, have these traditions? He says, we get a cue here from a previous paper in this sequence that we've been considering here. He says, if there's no discipline in a factory, the workers become anxious and terrified. And Popper says, I don't want to discuss discipline. That's not my point. But here's what I do have to say. If the workers have nothing to go on, they become anxious and terrified. Put it in a more general way, whenever we happen to be surrounded by either a natural environment or a social environment of which we know so little that we cannot predict what will happen, we all become anxious and terrified. And there's a third emotion that he'll bring up in just a bit as well, frustration, right? And we might think of others, people get depressed, we could add additional ones in here. But the key is that traditions allow us to predict what's going to happen in our natural or social environment. Do they allow us to predict it with perfect certainty? We never make mistakes? No, he's not claiming that. But there is a big difference between not having a clue what the hell is going on around you or how to get by and actually having some sense of muddling through of better and worse choices that you can make, of who you can ask questions to, and things like that. So he goes on and he says that it's institutions and traditions which give people, or may give people, a clear idea of what to expect and how to proceed. We don't just want to sit back and predict, we actually want to get by in a world that includes natural objects, that includes social institutions, that includes other people. We want to have some sort of sense of how things actually work. So he says, what we call social life can exist only if we can know and can have confidence that there are things and events which must be so and cannot be otherwise. And so he says, this is where the part played by tradition in our lives becomes understandable. So we're looking for regularities and order, as he calls it, in life to which we can adjust ourselves. There's a back and forth that goes on. And he says, the mere existence of these regularities is perhaps more important than their peculiar merits or demerits. They are needed as regularities and therefore handed on as traditions, whether or not they're in other respects rational or necessary or good or beautiful or whatever you will. There is a need for tradition in social life. What happens when we don't actually have this? Well, this is where he says, lacking these, we get anxious. We don't know exactly what we're afraid of. Or there's another modality of fear, terrified. We become panicked when we don't know what to do. Or, and I like the fact that he brought this up, frustrated. We can have other emotional responses besides just those within the range of fear, can't we? We could become angry. We could become despondent. We could become despairing. We don't want those things, so we need traditions to satisfy the desire not to fall into these emotions. So he's going to go on and say something really interesting here. The creation of traditions plays a role similar to that of theories. Why? Our scientific theories are instruments by which we try to bring some order into the chaos in which we live to make it rationally predictable. And he says, I don't want you to take this as a deep philosophical pronouncement. It's just a statement of one of the practical functions of our theories. Similarly, the creation of traditions, like so much of our legislation, has just that same function of bringing some order and rational predictability into the social world in which we live. It is not possible for you to act rationally in the world if you have no idea how it will respond to your actions. Every rational action assumes a certain system of reference which responds in a predictable or partly predictable way. And so he says, just as the invention of myths or theories in the field of natural science has a function, bringing order to the events of nature, so has the creation of traditions in the field of society. So, indicating there an important distinction. Natural world, world of society, traditions are about, and they're situated within society. Science, scientific theories, and the other things that we could bring up in that respect are about nature. Myths are largely about that. Although, really, we go back, we see that myths have social functions as well. They explain, how society began, who did the first crime, how was it punished, what is the function of human beings in relation to the gods. We don't need to go on. So this is a very interesting point. And then he's going to talk about a double function to tradition, which is not only creating a certain order or something like a social structure, that's already been discussed, but they do something else. They give us something upon which we can operate, something we can criticize and change. And he says this point is decisive for us as rationalists and social reformers. And then this is going to lead into a discussion of a sort of misguided rationalism that Popper has criticized in other places. He is going to reject what he calls social reformers' proposals to wipe the canvas clean. So what is wipe the canvas clean? You've made a work of art. You look at it, a painting, and you're like, this isn't very good. I should try again. Let's just take a sponge and get rid of all the pigments on the canvas. We'll repaint it again, and then we'll start anew. And it's going to be better this time because I'm going to think it through, and it'll be much more pleasing or beautiful or good or whatever it is that you want to do. And he says, well, Plato did that. You would wipe everything off and start from scratch with a brand new rational world. And Popper's going to say, listen, that is just impossible. It's nonsense. It's impossible to realize. And here's a couple reasons why. So the first is that he says, there's no reason to believe a blueprinted world will be any better than the world in which we live. Why would it be any better? He says, as a matter of fact, here's some reasons why not. If you're trying to create something that already does exist and you're trying to make a better version of it, would you just get rid of everything that you had before? He says, an engineer does not create a motor engine just from blueprints. He develops it from earlier models. He changes it, he alters it over and over again. If we wipe out the social world in which we live, wipe out its traditions, and create a new world on the basis of blueprints, well, there's no guarantee that's actually going to work in the first place. And, here we get to the second one, the problem of what he calls little changes and adjustments. So let's say we do wipe everything away, and we create some new blueprint and we impose it on the world. The world actually doesn't say, oh, cool, you've decided on something new. I am going to go along with it. No, we find we have to tinker around with things. So take Plato's Republic, for example. There's 3 classes in society. There's the guardian class who are concerned with the intellect and ruling. There's the auxiliaries who do all the things like protecting the society, enforcing the rules. And then there's everybody else. And you might say that everybody else, you probably need to think through how these people are going to live and work. You didn't talk enough about that. Well, that's little adjustments, right? Maybe this class has to do things differently than this class. And Popper says, listen, if you're going to have to make little changes and adjustments, which will be needed in any case, why not start them here and now in the social world, which we have? It doesn't matter what you have and where you start. You must always make little adjustments. Since you have to make them, it's very much more sensible and reasonable to start with what happens to exist at the moment. Because of these things which exist, we at least know where the shoe pinches. We know of certain things, they're bad, and we want them changed. If we wipe everything out, we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage. And then he also says, listen, the idea of canvas cleaning, it's just impossible anyway. Why? He says, if you clean the social canvas and you wipe out the tradition, you sweep away yourself with it and all your ideas and all the blueprints of the future. The blueprints have no meaning in an empty social world, in a social vacuum. They only have meaning in a setting of traditions and institutions, such as myths, poetry, and values, all of which emerge from the social world in which we live. So the very incentive and desire to build a new world would disappear once the traditions of the old world have been destroyed. And, Plato actually did respond to this paradox within the Republic. Well, we'll have to get rid of all the old people and begin anew. Well, that means getting rid of Plato. He's one of the old people at that point. So Popper is pointing out what he thinks to be a conceptual problem, an impossibility if we really think things through. So traditions actually do, in fact, serve some pretty important purposes within social life. They may not always serve them well, and that points to the need to have a critical attitude towards tradition rather than an uncritical, accepting attitude, or one bound by taboos, as he's going to call them. But Popper is making a lot of room here for what we could call healthy, robust traditions that would serve some really vital purposes in human societies. And that means for us in human life as we can possibly conceive of it.